On behalf of the entire City Club Missoula board, I'd like to thank all of you for your support this past year. Not only the individuals that come, but also all of the many sponsors that support City Club Missoula throughout the year. We really appreciate your support, so thank you. A special thanks also goes out to MCAT for recording our monthly forums and making those available to the entire community on their website, mcat.org. And due to the unique nature of today's event, we will not have our usual table talk. As many of you know, that's when we gather together and come up with one question each from each table. Instead, we will have time for individual questions after both of our guests present. So we have two folks running around with mics. Larry and John will be helping us out with that. So if you have a question at the end of the presentation, just raise your hand and we'll take it from there. At this time, I'd like to introduce fellow board member Susan Hay Patrick, who will introduce today's forum. Thank you.
I can't believe she didn't mention the fireplace. That was so cool. So usually, you know, at City Club, we like to discuss provocative issues and foster civil discourse, but at December, we like to lighten it up and do something more, a little lighter in spirit. And that's why we invited our two speakers here today. I could spend the next half hour talking about both of them because they are so accomplished, but I'm not going to do that. I'm first going to introduce Beth Judy, author of Bold Women in Montana History, which is really a wonderful book, and you should all buy it. Some of you know Beth as Flora Delaterre on formerly the NPR Plant Detective series. Beth grew up near Chicago. She got her BA from Harvard. She moved to Atlanta, worked in public health, the arts, writing and publication services. She moved to Missoula in 1992, got her MFA in creative writing at the University of Montana, and then was a producer from 94 to 2014 of The Plant Detective. She has written as a freelance writer for Prairie Home Companion and Montana Magazine, among other publications. She loves history, traveling, nature, and living in Montana. So you will hear more from Beth about some of the bold women in our state's history. And now to the man who needs no introduction, Pat Williams. And by the way, there is no truth to what he said to me earlier that I told him if he didn't give me a bio, I would say any damn thing I pleased. That is not exactly how I remember it. Pat is a third-generation Montanan, served more consecutive terms in the U.S. House than anyone in Montana history. He started as a teacher in Butte, as a state legislator, then as our congressman, later as a faculty member at the university. Pat has remained devoted to serving the people of our state and making Montana a better place for future generations. He has always fought for education, for the arts, for kids and families, for folks with disabilities, and on behalf of the voiceless. His leadership helped pass more trailblazing legislation than I can list here. Things like the Family and Medical Leave Act, which helped make sure workers wouldn't lose their jobs during maternity leave or while caring for a sick family member. Did somebody start an applause? Because I would applaud. He helped create our tribal colleges, save and protect wilderness areas in our national parks, to create the Corporation for Public Service. As chairman of the Post-Secondary Education Committee in the House, Pat protected the National Endowment from the Arts from elimination, a remarkable undertaking at the time. Anybody remember the Robert Mapplethorpe exhibit? He was unwavering in his defense of freedom of speech and creativity, and he is recognized as the leader who saved the NEA during the 90s. I was a lobbyist on food stamps at the time, and I always loved that the guy from Montana not only was there for me on the right votes, but was fighting for the arts. It was awesome. So along with a passion for politics, policies, and place, Pat is passionate about his family. His wife, Carol, who served in the Montana House and also served as both minority and majority leader in the Montana Senate, and their 3 kids, Griff, Aaron, and Whitney, and their 3 grandchildren. So a raconteur extraordinaire. I told him, we are time limited. We have to get out of here at 1. We are lucky that this guy with 1,000 stories will share some of them with us today. So please welcome Beth Judy and Pat Williams.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me all right? I want to thank Susan, hey Patrick, and City Club and Eric for having me here today, and it's such an honor to be warming up the stage for Pat Williams, of whom I'm a long-time fan and admirer. So Susan showed you my book. It will be for sale right over there in the back. So it's called Bold Women in Montana History. And my friend Betsy actually suggested my sequel, and I haven't started working on it yet, but tell me if you think this is a good idea. Bald Men in Montana History. Yeah? Okay. I'll start working on it. I am not really telling stories today, but I've got some pictures to show you, and I'll touch in on the biographies of that are presented in 3 of my chapters. Just a little bit of history. And by the way, my book is for young adults, but mostly adults seem to be reading it, and it does contain some new historical findings. It's 11 chapters about different women, and I couldn't tell you about all of them, so I selected 3 chapters to focus on, and my filter for choosing them was actually Pat Williams. How is this? Well, I know that he knew some of these women, and one of them, I wonder if he ever met her. So that's how I selected my women, and we'll find out if he chooses to share. So I have my little thing here, and I have never done a PowerPoint show before, so old dogs can hopefully lose new tricks, lose their minds, learn new tricks. And so tell me if, I can't see too well, so tell me if a slide is wrong. I'm beginning with Jeanette Rankin. There she is. She was a great hat wearer, and that's a beauty. Probably you all know, but if you don't, I'm glad to tell you that she was born in Missoula, and she's most famous as America's first Congresswoman. She was elected in 1916, just after women in Montana got the vote, but before women throughout America could vote yet. So that came later. Jeanette's dad, John Rankin, the Rankin family were early settlers in Missoula. John Rankin was a builder and an engineer. And he built some of Missoula's first bridges, actually, and other things that are important. I put forward a thesis in my chapter that Jeanette inherited her dad's engineering mind. And there's evidence of that from throughout her life. She loved to build things, and I'm talking, out of wood. And she loved to study how things worked, machines, and she took a furniture design course, and she experimented later in her life with her own houses, all kinds of different systems in her own houses. And this is going to sound bad, but it's kind of lucky for us that at her time and in this place, Montana, it was pretty well impossible for her to become an engineer or a builder. And why is that lucky? Because she applied her engineer's mind to the problems of society, which were severe at the time. We're talking the early 1900s. We're talking severe poverty, disease, injustice. What Jeanette decided to build was a better world, a better country, a better society. And because she was very passionate, she pursued solutions with a vengeance. For a while, though, she only had mixed results. For example, she studied social work, and she went and she worked in an orphanage, but she said, this is not going to fix anything. So finally, she decided on some other solutions for what would fix American society. One of them was suffrage. If women can vote, women will fix society. Another thing was laws and legislation. And that's one reason why she wanted to go to Congress, So, for example, there were no food safety laws, there were no labor laws, or very few. Sanitation was a problem. Child health laws needed putting in place. One of the final solutions that she saw, but she hit on it early on, was pacifism. And she became world known for her advocacy for peace and her hard work for peace worldwide. And people still know Jeannette Rankin worldwide as a pacifist. And interestingly, just after our election, in the later half of Jeanette's life, she focused on electoral reform. And she had a system in mind that would be more accurate and fair. And it is a form of voting that is still put forth today as a potential reform for how we vote in America. The main reason I really was excited, other than Pat Williams, to tell you about Jeannette is that it has to do with her house. And you may know that she grew up on her family ranch about 6 miles up Grant Creek. It's a ranch now owned by Phyllis and Dennis Washington. Let's see here. Oops. That's her family. It was 6 girls and a boy. They're flanked by their parents. And among the kids, Jeannette is sitting, and she's in back, and she's the first on the left. When Jeannette was 5, and that's 1885, her family did that typical ranch family thing where they wanted to live in town in the winter so that their kids would have easier access to school. And so John Rankin, the engineer and builder, built a house. And the reason I'm excited to tell you about it is because it was just about where we're sitting. And not everybody knows that. So and maybe some people here will remember it. That would be really neat to hear. Because I think it was torn down maybe in the 60s when the highway was coming through. It wasn't exactly here, but I believe it was across Front Street in that overflow parking lot behind the Jiffy Lube. So there hasn't been anything there but a parking lot for years. Isn't that a shame? Because this is the house. And these are not great pictures. I took them off the web. But I couldn't find any other pictures of it, but I wanted to give you an idea of how cool it was. It was the first house in Missoula with central heating and hot and cold running water. And amazingly to all, it also had a bathtub. And from that cupola, you could look out over town. Here's another picture of it from closer up. So now when you pass that parking lot and the Jiffy Lube, you can think about Jeannette Rankin and her house. The next person I'm going to tell you about is Myrna Loy. And so she was not a Missoulian, she was a Hellenan. She did not start out in a house like Jeannette Rankin's, and she didn't even start life with the name Myrna Loy. This is her with her parents. She was actually born Myrna Williams in Helena, Montana. But later, when she was starting her acting career in Hollywood, friends advised her that Williams was too plain. And I apologize for that, Pat. Apparently, one of her friends suggested Loy, and apparently that comes from a Chinese poem. So I said that she was born in Helena, and when she was a child, her family did move back to Helena. But when Myrna was little, the family actually lived in the Crow Creek Valley, which is up against the Elkhorn Mountains near the tiny little town of Raidersburg, which is southeast of Helena. Both sides of Myrna's family homesteaded there in that spot. And there are lots of Williamses in the Raidersburg Cemetery. Myrna is actually buried in Helena. Myrna started working while she was in high school, and in fact, she never graduated because she just got caught up in work. And she came to acting through dance. That's what really motivated her, was dance. As an actor, Myrna is most famous for the movie The Thin Man and its sequels. In 1937, she was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, and I seem to remember that she was the highest paid female actor that year. She was definitely one of the hardest working actors in Hollywood. Starting at age 20, she was in 127 movies. And after her career took off, she didn't take a vacation for 10 years. She was working often on multiple movies at once. In her early career, for a long time, she was stuck in certain genres and roles, and she couldn't break out. And you still hear of that happening in Hollywood. For a while, her genre was gangster movies. So there's some old gangster movies you can see Myrna Loy in. But for longer, back when Hollywood was segregated, white people often played people of color, and Myrna was always cast as Asian or African American or Native American or Mexican because apparently Hollywood perceived her face as a blank canvas. Typical of America at this time, these women of color were often villains. But finally, a director recognized more in Myrna than these terrible stereotypes. He suspected that she might be great in comedy. And there's a story that to audition her for The Thin Man, he pushed her into a pool at a Hollywood party to see how she would handle it. Does that sound kind of like a Me Too moment or what? Apparently, Myrna passed with flying colors and her career was launched. I also discovered writing this book how politically involved Myrna was, and she credited growing up in Montana for that. There are lots of instances of that, but I'll give you two. In 1938, after Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, Myrna publicly expressed support for the ousted leaders. That so infuriated Hitler that he banned her movies in Germany, which really shows how much power she had. And here she is with Lucille Ball and Frederick March, other actors of her time. This is in the 1940s, and Myrna joined other movie industry people to fight the activities of the House Un-American Committee. And here they're recording a radio broadcast protesting the committee investigations. So Myrna Loy is one of the people who helped bring Joseph McCarthy down. I was really glad to include her in my book. She's wonderful. She hasn't gotten a lot of press. Partly that's because she was very private and she controlled what came out about her. But people are starting to forget about her, so I wanted to have her in the book. And so my suggestion to you is, as you try to relax this holiday, because that's not always what we think of. We wish we could relax at holidays, but Christmas is kind of a hectic time. Pop some popcorn for yourself and your family one night and find yourself a Myrna Loy movie and watch this wonderful Montanan in action. My final subject is not one woman. It's a women's union. It's the Women's Protective Union in Butte. It's chapter 5 in my book. If the union had been a person, she would have lived a long life. She would have been 83 when she died. The Women's Protective Union was founded in 1890 for any working woman who didn't already have a union to belong to. So if you were a telephone operator, you probably already had a union. But this was for other women, chambermaids, waitresses, servants, bucket girls, those women who made the lunches for the miners, janitresses, and I didn't know that word until I started researching this book, janitresses, usherettes, cooks, dress and hat makers, factory workers, sales clerks, and more. One year, the WPU roster even included a female chimney sweep and a fortune teller. And I would really like, as a writer, to one day make a story where I actually have those two people in it. The Women's Protective Union did all the usual union things. It fought for better wages, fair working conditions, a stop to harassment, and basically a voice and dignity for its members. During those 83 years, the WPU actually only struck twice. That was in 1920 and in 1949, because after all, strikes were risky, and other forms of persuasion usually worked. In my chapter, I focus on two of the most beloved leaders of the WPU for decades, and those are Lena Matosh. And Lena Matosh's maiden name was Antonoli, a name that you may recognize from both Missoula and Butte. And Bridget Shea. Oh, by the way, Lena is to the left. She's the tallest woman there. And then Bridget Shea is here with her family. Bridget was an Irish immigrant to Butte. Lena was born to Italian immigrants who ran a dairy farm in Ramsey, just west of Butte. And for decades, these two women were colleagues, but also they were the best of friends. And their official name or title was Walking Delegate. And walk they did. They walked all over Butte. And so here they are, one tall, one short, and they always wore black. And that started out because of being in mourning, but they realized that it was very intimidating. And so they actually struck fear into employers' hearts by walking around in their black clothes, and they would show up unexpectedly in union shops. And so they were, dropping in to see if everything was okay. If it wasn't, and there were some employers who just wouldn't take wouldn't work with them, they were known to grab a broom and chase him. So that was one of those other modes of persuasion that they used. You might wonder, is a woman's union different from any other union? Mainly, it's not. But two instances come to mind that illustrate how the WPU was in fact different, and perhaps why it meant so much to its members. I learned about the first instance actually from Whitney Williams, Pat's daughter, who researched the WPU when she was a student, and I interviewed her. She told me about finding these rectangular pieces of silk in the archives that said "on strike." And here it is, and it actually looks kind of big, but I would say it was probably about this big from talking with Whitney. Whitney just couldn't figure out what these things were, so she asked a former WPU member. And the woman looked at her kind of like she was dumb, and she said, you can't hold a child and a picket sign at the same time. So they would pin these banners on their clothes so that they could hold their child. So that's one difference, I think, that women are always juggling children and work at the same time. And it also means, it just shows how high their stakes are and were. The second instance is just thinking about infant mortality in Butte. It was very high in the early days of the WPU, and members, of course, were often very poor. The WPU kept a supply of clean white infant dresses so that members who lost a child would have at least that. This was something that union dues paid for, so you knew the dress came from women who had gone through the same thing. That sense of solidarity was one of the greatest gifts the WPU gave women in Butte. I wanted to include some of the WPU's later leaders in my chapter, especially a woman named Val Webster, but it turned out that we just didn't have space. But before I figured that out, I got a photo of Val from the Butte archives to use in the book. And here it is. And if you look, you'll see that there's a young Pat Williams in that photograph. And I think he's doing some heavy flirting. In fact, I know Pat has, so this is proof that he knew women in the WPU, and in fact, I do know that he has family history with the WPU. So to end, I'll just say that in Butte, many people still remember the WPU with fondness and gratitude for the voice and the hand up it gave to their mother or their grandmother or their aunts, and so their entire family. But others don't know about it, and that knowledge is being lost. So I'm really glad that the story's in my book. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. No, I'm not. I'm Myrna's younger brother, Pat Loy. It's wonderful to see you. I want to say for your benefit that I knew Jeanette and had a lunch for her, a well-attended lunch for her in Washington. She was there for her 90th birthday. She'd also been there to protest the war on Vietnam. I said, Jeanette, what would you like to be remembered for? And she said, well, Mr. Williams, people assume I want to be remembered for my vote against both wars, including when I was the only one to vote against World War II. And she said, I suppose that's all right because I don't like war. But she said, no one does. It's like being for a major earthquake. None of us like war. She said, what I would really like to be remembered for is being the only woman who ever voted to give all women the right to vote. How about that? And I knew one of those last characters that Beth talked about, Val Webster. And I said, tell me about the Union, Val. And I remembered it as a kid growing up in Butte. And each member of my family, I mean, all my aunts, on my mother's side, my mother and my grandmother, all belonged to the WPU. You know, if you worked in Butte, you belonged to a union, over and out, period. That was it. And so women worked, they belonged to the WPU. And I said, you ever have trouble with an all-women union, Val? And she said, well, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, we got a letter from the Department of Labor. Every union in America got it. And the question was, do you have any women in your union? She said, we checked yes and sent it back. Let me look closer at my note here because I thought I had another one I wanted to mention. Oh, Bridgie Shea. Yeah, Bridgie Shea. She was the head of the union and probably one of the, I don't know what you'd say about her, probably one of the toughest, most determined characters I'd ever met. She had a tough job. Even though women gladly joined the WPU, she had to deal with all the other unions, which were mostly men. And for some reason that created, as a man, I can't understand it, but some reason that created difficulty in Bridgie Shea's life. Let me deal with a couple of characters that I've known. One of them's a guy named Spud, S-P-U-D, Spud Murphy. In Butte, everybody gives you a nickname, you know. My name is actually John. It's not Pat, it's John. People in Butte said he didn't look like a John. Looks like his grandfather, Pat. And so many people called me Pat for so many years that I changed my name. I actually legally changed my name, yeah. So Spud Murphy, an Irishman in Butte, just over, an immigrant like my grandmother, she used to say, know him, I came over on the boat with him. Anytime you'd ask about somebody, oh, I came on the boat with him, I thought, God, that's a hell of a big boat. I don't know. It was Spud got me a job underground. He was a shift boss for the old Anaconda Company, ACM. He got me a job with the ACM underground. It only lasted a week. My mom found out I was working in the mines instead of on top, and she made them fire me. But, the first day, we were down in a stope, and you come down the shaft, and then you work the stope. We were down in a stope following a vein, and I heard Spud Murphy up the end of the stope, and he said, Patrick, is you down there? And I said to the two guys I was working with, who didn't want this kid working with them, you know, because you had to be safe down there. And I didn't know a damn thing about mining and should never have been there in the first place. But anyhow, I said to them, oh, that's Spud Murphy. They said, we know who the hell it is. Tell them you're down here. It's okay. The only thing I did right that shift, I said, yes, Mr. Murphy, I'm down here. He said, how many of you is there? I said, there are 3 of us. He said, half of you come up. That was interesting from here to hear that, because the front row here laughed first, and then it sort of rolled to the back. And in the back, they were saying, what did he say? I knew a guy over there named John T. Shea. And John T. was a, I don't know, Butte guy and proud of the city. And when one of the new reforms, there's always a reform out there somewhere, and when one of the new reforms came, they decided to clean up the city, not only by actually cleaning up the city, but by tearing down the gallows frames, you know, those huge frames over the mines. I was over there this weekend and went to Helena and then to Butte with some friends for the Governor's Arts Awards. And so a big crowd of us over there. And we were looking at the gallows frame, and I told them the story about John T., who said, you shall not tear down these gallows frames. And John T. had no authority except people in Butte listened to him. And the EPA didn't. And so the head of the EPA over there ordered that they come down. And so the first one came down. And John T. Shea was on the front page of the Montana Standard with this statement: "You may have torn the first one down, but you'll hang from the second one." They're all still up. Have you noticed? How are we doing on time? We got to give a few minutes for questions, all right? Maybe I'll tell you this, and then if I have room, I'll tell you another one. My grandma used to buy, let's see, we're close to Christmas now, so this is the holy season. And I went to church this morning, and I got absolution for telling you this joke. My grandma used to, when she'd shop, anytime she bought a major item, which to her was a sofa or a refrigerator, she'd buy it from the boss, the guys whose name was on the store, was on the front of the store. She said, "That's the best warranty." And I think she's probably right about that. So she wanted to buy a new electric washing machine. And she went down to a place named Oxley's, and she insisted that George Oxley sell her let her pick out, advise, and then sell her the washing machine. She brought it home. I remember it well. My grandma helped raise me. And it was gleaming white, you know, and had paddles in it. And the paddles go this way and that way and this way and that way, right? And a little big black hose coming into it. And so she proudly told them where to put it out on the back porch. They put it there, and she turned the hoses on and put soap in and all the dirty clothes, and she turned it on. And I'm getting ahead of myself in this story. Excuse me, let me go back a step. There's no better way to break up a story than what I'm about to do. When Oxley showed it to her, he showed her the different things on it, and he said, "Now look down in here, Lizzie." And she was very impatient. She wanted to get out of there and get it home and whatnot. He said, "Sometimes the paddles aren't going at the right speed. So look down in here," and down there was a turn knob. And he said, "They call that the governor, and you just turn it this way or that." And she said, "Okay." So anyhow, it broke down, or it wouldn't start. And as she called him up, she said, "I was home. I was there. I heard her." She said, "George, this goddamn thing you sent me won't work." He said, "Well, what'd you do?" And she told him, "Is there water in it?" "Yeah." "Is there soap in it?" "Okay." He said, "Well, did you try screwing down the governor?" She said, "Screwing him? I didn't even vote for the son of a bitch." I know some of you are having a good time with that, but there's about a fourth of you who are not laughing at that. If I got any more time, somebody tell me. If I get, I was in Congress, and Carol decided she wanted to go to Ireland, just a private trip. You taxpayers weren't on the hook for this. And she wanted to go to Ireland, and so away we went. We took the 3 kids and went to Ireland, and it was fantastic. We went to a place called Ballybunion, and so I went to see Tip O'Neill, the old speaker, before I left. Tip was one of the great people I've ever known in my life, by the way. And I said, "Mr. Speaker, I'm going to Ireland." "Oh, love of God, you're taking Carol, aren't you?" I said, "Indeed I am, Mr. Speaker." And I said, "We've got 3 kids and taking the kids. Is there anything I need to know?" He said, "Yes, yeah, there is something." He said, "When you're in Dublin," I assume you'll be in Dublin, "Yes, sir. You go down," he showed me where to go from Grafton Street down across the old green and to the old hospital. He said, "Look at that hospital and look closely at it. And I want you to pay attention to the inscription over the doorway." Now, he said, "Then remember this story. The American industrialist Henry Ford was in Dublin, and he had the top suite of rooms. And after he was there a few days, a knock came to the door unexpectedly. The butler answered the door, and it was the mayor of Dublin and all of the councilmen, the aldermen. They asked if they could get in and see the great Ford. Permission was granted, and they came, they sat, then Ford came in, and they talked for 10 or 15 minutes, just greeting him, welcoming him there. And as they were leaving, the alderman left first, and then the mayor right behind them, and as the mayor was walking out the front door, he turned to Ford and he said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Ford, just an afterthought." He said, "You know, sir, we're trying to build a new hospital here in Dublin. It's badly needed. You can see that things are not good here. And we're trying to do it, sir, entirely with private donations. And, sir, we were wondering," and Ford put up his hand and called for his checkbook, and he wrote them out a check for a pretty good sum in those days, $5,000. And the mayor thanked him, and the aldermen who were standing in the anteroom applauded him, and the door was shut, and all was fine until the next morning. And the Dublin newspaper had a front-page headline in it that said, "American Ford contributes $50,000 to new hospital." And shortly after Mr. Ford had had his coffee and read that paper, and it's the mayor. And he comes in, he holds it up, and he said, I don't even want to sit. I just want to say to you, Mr. Ford, that we're terribly embarrassed by this. And as soon as we're done, I'm going to go down to the Times, the newspaper, and I'm going to say to them, no, Mr. Ford didn't give $50,000. He only gave," and Ford stopped him and called for his checkbook. Wrote him out the remaining, true story, by the way, wrote him out the remaining $45,000, tore off the check, and as the mayor reached for the check, he pulled it back and he said, "Your Honor, I think that for $50,000 I should have something to say about this new hospital." "Anything you want, Mr. Ford." He said, "All right, I should like to dictate the inscription that shall go over the front doorway." And so Tip said, "So go and take a look at that hospital, Pat. Part of it's gone, but that doorway and the inscription's still there. And it says, 'I came among ye, and ye took me in.'" Merry Christmas.
Yes? No?
Yes.
Thank you both. That was great. I'm going to buy a couple of the books. And I want to, it hasn't worked in our private conversations, Pat, so I'm going to put you on the spot. When's your book going to come out?
Well, thanks, Russ. My book is not on sale, but I hope you'll buy it too. No, I'm kidding. I'm really writing it for my grandkids, but I've gotten so into it that I suppose I'll publish it one of these days. It'll be out soon. I've been telling Dan Kimmis that for 5 years.
I'm looking in this area for a hand up, but if not, can you talk about Evel Knievel?
Yeah, Bobby and I are, Evel's name is Bobby, and Bobby and I are I don't know why, but I can't talk for more than 30 seconds without, what are you going to do? Oh, you're going to move it, all right. Evel and I are first cousins. His mother and my mother are sisters, and Bobby and I grew up pretty much in the same house. Our grandmas, 2 houses, really. Our grandmas helped raise us. His because his family was separated. Mine because my mom and dad worked about 15 hours a day. We had 2 restaurants on Park Street, and they were busy as hell. And some of my older relatives, all gone now, used to say, "Now that's the excuse you ought to keep using, Pat. Actually, the reason they sent you up to your grandma's is they didn't like you." I don't know for sure, but Bobby, here, I've got a half hour worth of stories on Bobby. But look, Bobby Bobby was, he was really getting famous, and then he said he was going to jump the Grand Canyon. Bobby's thing was not just that he was athletic, which he was extraordinarily athletic. He could walk on his hands when he was 4 years old. And, but he was smart, and he was clever, and he wasn't getting big enough crowds, so he offered to jump the Grand Canyon. Well, that's pretty good after you've been jumping 14 cars, if you're going to jump the Grand Canyon on a motorcycle. And so about 2 or 3 years before he ended up trying to jump the Snake River Canyon, I saw him at his brother's bar in Butte. And I said to him, Bobby, look at this. And I took a clipping out of my wallet that I'd been saving, and it said, Knievel offers to jump Grand Canyon. I said, what the hell is this? And he reached in his wallet, and he took out a clipping that said, Pat Williams to run for legislature. And he said, if you can jump the people of Butte, I can jump the Grand Canyon. Then the other quick one so I saw him not long before the canyon jump. I wasn't able to go to it. My whole family was there. But not long before, and I said, Bobby, are you really going to jump the Snake River Canyon? And he said, not unless the bastards corner me. Meaning, I don't know, probably wasn't trying to get out of it, but that's the way it sounded. And then, because I couldn't go, the morning of the canyon jump, I got a telegram. And the telegram says, Pat, the bastards cornered me.
I have a question for both of you. What would each one of you like to be remembered for?
Oh, I think for having so damn many friends.
I can't think that fast. That sounds really, really great. I agree with Pat.
All the questions are over here.
I got this.
Oh, you got one? Okay.
Question for Pat. Pat, you and I have had this conversation before, but people like to bring up Jeanette Rankin. But why is it that we as political people need to remember Rankin? What importance has she been in your life? When we make tough votes, why do we think of Rankin?
Well, if there are any office holders here, you will face tough votes. And sometimes 50% of your constituents just aren't with you. Except we don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic, purposefully. And the purpose of the republic was to say, we'll get people and we'll vote for them to hold these jobs. Because having the job, having all the information about the job, having people come in and testify, talking to expert after expert before you vote is really important. And sometimes, see, I'm not running for anything now. Sometimes more than 50% of the people are simply wrong. And you've got to do what you think is right based on the best information you have. I got that from two people. Jeanette, who gave me a lecture, not because I had voted wrong in her opinion, but just saying some of the same things I'm saying to you. And the other one was Mike Mansfield, who used to vote for gun control. And he said, look, people sent me here to make up my own mind based on the best judgment I have. And the best judgment I have is there are too damn many guns in America. So he voted against 87% of Montanans at the time. You do what's right. You stay honest to yourself. That's the best way to do it. You sleep really good.
I want to ask a question. Oh, sorry. Was there somebody?
Peggy?
Well, I'll just quickly ask, did you know Myrna Loy? Are you related to Myrna Loy?
No.
Okay.
Question for Beth. So when you were starting the research on your book, I wonder if there were women you ended up writing about whom you had no idea who they were when you started. What were the surprises for you as you went about doing your research for the book?
There were so many surprises. I got a huge list of suggested women that I began with. And for example, I had been to, I would have said Pitamakan Falls in Glacier Park, Bidamakan in Blackfeet, but I really didn't know the story, and that's Running Eagle, who was a warrior, a Blackfeet warrior from 1820 to 1850 about. I didn't know that when I started. Isabel Johnson, an artist, one of our first modern artists in Montana, from Absorki, a homesteader family over there, Norwegian American in Absorki. I had never heard of her, but she was very important, both as a painter and as a teacher, who influenced a whole new generation of artists like Ted Waddell, for example, that he might be the most famous of them. There were so many discoveries in doing my book, and that was one of the hugest joys, as you can imagine, of doing my book. Just bald men. No, I don't know. I have to recover.
By the way, one of the people, if I was an elected official now, one of the people I'd watch in order to know how to make tough votes would be Diane Sands.
My name is Gwen Langford Spencer, and this is a question for Pat. I'm Rhonda Whiting's daughter, who he knows well. I've heard you refer to Butte as the 8th reservation in Montana, and I guess I've always assumed it was because of that pride of place, and I've always loved that description of Butte. As a native Montanan, there's times when you get called upon to explain, what is it about Butte? And I've heard you talk about it in several different ways. One of the ways I really loved is the NPR program that you did many years ago. You talked about Butte and the meaning for Butte, America, and even how it changed European policies, that some of the things that happened there. But could you just tell us in your words, when, so that maybe we can have some guidance when people ask us about Butte, what it means? I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
Well, people in Butte say the best thing about Butte is it's so damn close to Montana. They mean that. I mean, they actually mean that, not just about Montana, but because they recognize Butte is perceived as being sort of separate somehow. And it's almost as if you need a immigration card to get in there. You know? I'm sorry I can't answer it better. I do call it the 8th reservation because it's tribal. The people there are tribal in many regards. Part of it just being I'm a Butte person, I'm a Butte guy, or I'm a Butte woman. Its history peels back like an onion. And I don't know. Maybe if you'd asked me a couple of years ago before I really got intensely into this book I'm writing, I might have answered it. But now that I've had to rediscover what is it about Butte, I'm going back in history and I'm trying to find the words, and I'm not finding them. I just can't quite describe it.
John Badgley, Institute of the Rockies. Pat, I met you when you were serving and you were thinking about retiring. And you asked me what it was like, because I'd retired several times by then, continue to be so. But what interests me, and the question is, Congress offers a great learning opportunity. And I'm sure as an educator, you found yourself feeling, well, I'm really learning here more than I've ever learned. What happened after you left? Did you continue feeling you were learning, thanks to broadband and what you're doing? So, and have you learned more since then? And with regard to women, my question is about Cameron, a great photographer from over near Ekalaka. Was she in your book, and do you know about her?
I'll just quickly say that my book is published by Mountain Press, and Mountain Press has done a beautiful book on Evelyn Cameron. And I didn't want to do her because I felt like she had already sort of had enough coverage. That's not totally true, but there's another photographer named Julia Toole who I wanted to have in my book, who took a lot of pictures on the Cheyenne Reservation, important ones, but we didn't have room for her in the end.
That's a great question, John, and it's a delight to see you again. It's been a little while, my friend. Well, we never quit learning, and you certainly learn in Congress. I was there about 2 terms, and I said to a friend of mine who's passed away now, another congressman who was later governor of Washington State named Mike Lowry, I said, Mike, they ought to give people a master's degree when they do 2 terms in this place. It's true, because the learning, I mean, if you pay attention and you listen during testimony, the learning experience back there is extraordinary, particularly in your own areas, that is your own committees that have certain jurisdictions. You go to those committee hearings, and you become fairly expert. But then when I came home, I knew, too, there was a lot more to learn. And so I decided to attempt, and thanks to George Dennison, I got to do it. I decided to go to the best learning theater I've ever seen, which is the classroom when you're standing in front of it and teaching. You really can learn then. You learn about students individually. You learn more about your subject because, as you know, John, they press you. You got to know your stuff. And by the way, every year that goes by over here, the good students know their stuff better than last year's good students. Our dilemma, and I don't want to just refer to the university in this, is that there's now a big top, the best kids, but there's only a little bit of middle, and then there's a bottom. Students think they have to go to college, and in many ways I wish that every kid in America could go to college, but maybe not a university all the time. Maybe you're geared for something else. Should you have the liberal arts in your life? Absolutely. So I'd like to see carpentry shops teach a little poetry. But nonetheless, teaching is a marvelous way to learn.
Could you talk a little bit about Eloise Cobell, who I think is the last chapter of your book?
Another woman I'd be interested to know if Pat knew. Okay, well, I'd love to hear about that. Eloise Cobell, you know, people ask me who was my favorite woman, and I really did love all of these women as I got to know them. But Eloise Cobell probably is my favorite. If you don't know her, she also, like Running Eagle, was Blackfeet. And I think she was born around 1945. And she only died about 7 years ago. And she was just so strong, and that's why I think she was my favorite. She sued the government for 100 years of not accounting for Indian people's money. And this is individuals and tribal, whole tribes. And in 1887 or so, when the Dawes Act was enacted, which broke reservations up, the government was charged with being sort of like a bank, being a bank and a financial advisor for Indian people, all Indian people. And so that meant making sure that if they owned land, that it was used to create income for them, so timber or farming, leases, oil. And yet these, you know, Indian people are the poorest people in the United States, I think, and they would get these tiny little checks. And this was, you know, later on in modern times, but for the whole century, there was just this problem that Indian people had getting their own money. It was their money. It wasn't given to them in some way. And it happened on all levels because there was no system of accounting, and this was basically kind of covered up. I wonder if Pat would agree with that. But at all levels, it happened locally, it happened at the state level, and it happened federally, that this money, since it was not accounted for well, was easy to steal. and to use in other ways. And it was Eloise who was an accountant. And I thought that was really fun to have an accountant as a bold woman in Montana history. And she was also a banker. So you don't really think of them as, riding into battle. Well, she sure did. And so she just sued the government. She thought it would take about 3 years. It took 16. And it wasn't even finalized before she died. So she would have gotten money. And she didn't. She never got that money, but her family did. So she compared herself to a wolverine that bites and never lets go. And boy, that is so true. And she withstood even criticism within her own tribe. She just did what, speaking of doing what you think you have to do, she held on and she just took it to the end.
Well, Eloise was wonderful, and not as acquainted with her history as is Beth, but I count it as one of the proud things in my career. I was sort of the congressional point person for Eloise, trying to move these things through Congress. And just getting a hearing is a major piece of business in Congress, particularly when you're doing something for tribes, and not all tribes agree with what you're doing. So she had to face that within her own people. And that was more difficult than I think historians will know. But Eloise was great. And like Jeanette Rankin, with her, it was just about doing what was equitable and what was fair in her view. And you could not, any way, anyhow, stop her. You couldn't stop Eloise. And she was marvelous. Died way too soon.
I just wanted to add to that, if people haven't seen it, there's a wonderful documentary called 100 Years of Women's Fight for Justice. And if you can get a chance to view that, you see Eloise herself and hear her story from her own mouth in that. It's a wonderful documentary.
And I'll add one other thing, which was that it was really fun for me because this is a book for kids. I wanted to know about each woman's childhood and their whole story. And we think of Eloise just as this very intense later part of her life. But it was really fun for me to find out about her childhood because there really wasn't that much information. So I went to the Blackfeet Reservation and I interviewed her oldest best friend. And so I got all kinds of wonderful information about when they were kids. Wearing poodle skirts, fighting over who was better, Elvis Presley or the Beatles, et cetera. And so that's in my book too.
Dick? Just a quick question. Burton K. Wheeler had influence with Jeanette Rankin, and also, so what would you want us to know about Burton K. Wheeler?
Well, BK was one of the stalwarts in the Montana delegation of all time, one of the stalwarts. BK was a labor lawyer in Butte. They didn't call them labor lawyers then, but his main thing was defending miners with regard to work safety and broken contracts and the rest of it. I met BK briefly, and he was ill. He was ill when I met him, but you could sense the strength of him, even though he was ill. Mike Mansfield was once asked to name his 5 favorite senators, and BK and Lee Metcalf were 2 of them, and for the moment I've forgotten the other 3, but he didn't include himself within it. And what I do remember is the reporter who asked him that question said to me later, he said, God, everyone likes Mike. And he said, I admire the guy immensely, but he said he can be rude. I said, how's that? He said, I said to him, well, Senator, you haven't put yourself in it. You're the only majority leader ever from Montana, one of the few from the West. You're a great Montana senator. You didn't include yourself in the 5. And he said, you want me to answer your question, or would you rather answer it yourself? Mike would say yep and nope to everything. You remember on Meet the Press or Face the Nation, if they asked him a question that, in his view, wasn't really, I don't know, worth it. That's my term, not Mike's, but wasn't worth it. He'd just say nope or yep. And one fellow came up to me one time when I was a freshman. He was a former member of the Meet the Press panel. And he said to me, I wanted to find you. They tell me you're from Montana. I said, yes, sir. This is a freshman get-together with the media. He said, I want to tell you a story about your marvelous Senator Mike Mansfield. I said, all right. He said, well, we knew that Mike would answer half the questions yep and nope. So we would prepare 3 times as many questions for Mike as we would for anybody else. And he said, so we're going around the table and everything's going fine, and Mike's, giving us great answers to good questions. And he said, we're about running out of time. And he said, I'm looking at the other questioners like, hey, I don't want to go last. I don't want to go last. And they're all looking at him like, we're going to send it to you to go last with this guy. Because you got to fill up the last minute or so, right? So he said, geez, it gets to me and there's 45 seconds left. And he said, I asked him a question on foreign policy, and he said, nope. And he said, I didn't have any more questions. He said, hell, I'm making them up. He said, it takes forever to write these questions out. So he said, I asked him another one. And he said it again, nope. So he said, then it occurred to me what to ask him. And I said, Senator, next year is an election year. Several of your colleagues are considering running for president. Is that right? He said, yep. He said, well, we know who there are. There's 5 of them. 5 senators think about running for president. I'd like to name them. And he said, you just go down and, give me one sentence about each of them. And then he said, I made a mistake. I said, would that be all right? And he said, Mike said, nope. And he said, at that point, I got angry. And he said, I'm glad the old tapes from those days have been destroyed, because he said, I put my elbows, kind of pointed my elbows at him on the table, and I rudely said, well, Mike, who do you think will win? He said, now the first mistake was calling him Mike, right? I said, well, Mike, who do you think you'll win? And he said, Mike said, the Democrat. Mike was a Democrat. And now he said, I'm really furious because I've got about 6 seconds left. He said, how much do you think you'll win by, Senator? And he said, I'll be goddamned if he didn't say, by enough.
I'm getting word we have time for 2 more questions. Anybody? Yep or nope? Yep. Yeah. Hey.
You got time to put your coats on and leave now.
Can we say thank you?
Thank you, Beth Judy and Pat Williams. Thank you so much for being here today. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I hope you enjoyed our forum, the last one of the year, and we look forward to seeing you all next year in 2019. Our forum in January, the date has been changed. It will be January 28th. So keep that in mind. And thank you all for being here today.